The victim recognized the killer after death. A Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The Orchard at Thistlewood. The village of Thistlewood-on-Avon lay dozing beneath a September sky the colour of weak tea, and nothing in its winding lanes or its low grey church tower suggested that within 4 days it would harbour a murder so peculiar that even the local constabulary, accustomed to poached pheasants and the occasional drunken brawl outside the Fox and Hounds, would find themselves entirely out of their depth. Captain Arthur Hastings, newly returned from a spell of business in Buenos Aires, and glad of it, had accepted with pleasure the invitation of his old friend Gerald Latimer to spend a fortnight at Thistlewood Hall. The hall itself was not a grand house, a rambling Elizabethan structure with crooked chimneys and a walled orchard that had, in its day, supplied cider apples to half the county, but it possessed the particular charm of a place that had been loved by successive generations without ever being improved beyond recognition. "You'll like my Uncle Nathaniel," Gerald had said on the drive down from the station, steering his motor car rather too enthusiastically around the hedgerows. Difficult old bird, mind you, made his money in shipping insurance and never lets anyone forget it. But he's got a soft spot for house parties, and he's assembled rather a curious lot for this one. Hastings, gazing out at the ripening orchards, had asked idly who comprised this curious lot. "Well, there's my cousin Diana. You'll remember her. Dark hair, sharp tongue. She's engaged to a fellow called Rupert Ainsworth, a solicitor from Bristol, though I don't think Uncle Nathaniel approves of the match. Then there's Dr. Simon Faraday, who looks after the old man's gout and his heart both, and seems to have made himself indispensable in the process. And there's Miss Celia Vane, who paints rather badly and flatters rather well, and who my uncle has taken an inexplicable shine to these last months. Oh, and Colonel Bertram Ashworth, an old India crony of my uncle's, down on his luck if the cut of his coat is anything to go by." "A full house," Hastings observed. "Fuller than you know. My uncle also insists on including his solicitor, Mr. Aubrey Pemberton, who is drawing up some manner of new will, a fact which has set the entire household on edge, as you might imagine, since nobody knows quite how the pudding is to be sliced." It was this last detail that would return to Hastings again and again in the days that followed, though at the time he thought little of it beyond a passing sympathy for whichever relations found themselves disappointed. Thistlewood Hall received him with the particular warmth and particular chill that seemed to characterize houses in which money and family sentiment were about to collide. Nathaniel Latimer proved to be a barrel-chested man of 70, with fierce white eyebrows and a habit of thumping the arm of his chair to emphasize a point. He greeted Hastings cordially enough, remarked that any friend of Gerald's was welcome so long as he didn't expect the shooting to be up to much this year, and then promptly forgot him in favour of needling Colonel Ashworth about a debt of honour from some card game in Poona, decades past. Diana Latimer was as Gerald had described, dark-haired, quick-eyed, with a restlessness about her that Hastings put down, at first, to the ordinary nerves of a woman soon to be married. Her fiancé, Rupert Ainsworth, was a tall, correct young man, with the guarded manner of a solicitor, who has learned to say nothing that might later be quoted against him. Hastings found him pleasant enough, but oddly watchful, his eyes forever moving to Diana, and then, just as quickly, away. Dr. Faraday was a compact, energetic man in his 40s, who spoke of Nathaniel's heart condition with a gravity that seemed designed to remind the household how essential he had become. Miss Celia Vane, for her part, was younger than Hastings had expected, perhaps 35, with an artist's careless elegance and a laugh that came a fraction too readily. She sat beside Nathaniel at dinner that first evening, and Hastings noticed that Diana's eyes rested on the pair of them with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something uncomfortably close to both. It was over the port, when the ladies had withdrawn, that Nathaniel Latimer made the announcement that would prove, in retrospect, to be the true beginning of the affair. "I've asked Pemberton down to finalize my new will," he said, without preamble, thumping the table, so that the decanter trembled. "No sense pretending otherwise. You'll all know soon enough. There are to be changes, substantial ones. I find a man's obligations shift as he grows older, and mine are no exception." His fierce eyes moved round the table, to Gerald, to Rupert, to Colonel Ashworth, and lingered, Hastings thought, a half-second longer on each than courtesy required. "I'll say no more tonight. Pemberton arrives tomorrow, and the matter will be settled by Thursday." The silence that followed was the particular silence of people calculating, very quickly and very privately, what they stood to lose. Colonel Ashworth broke it first, with a bark of laughter that did not reach his eyes. "Come now, Nathaniel, you'll give the boy indigestion, springing that on us before the savoury." "Better indigestion now than a shock later," said Nathaniel, and reached for his glass with the satisfaction of a man who has enjoyed, rather more than he ought, the discomfort of his guests. Hastings, walking in the walled orchard the following morning to clear his head, reflected that there was something almost theatrical in the old man's timing, as though he had wanted every person at that table to feel, if only for an evening, the precariousness of his favour. It was not, Hastings thought, a kind way to run a household. But then, Nathaniel Latimer had never struck him as a kind man. He could not have known, as he walked beneath the heavy-laden apple boughs with the mist still clinging to the grass, that within 48 hours Nathaniel Latimer would be dead, and that the manner of his dying would pose a question so strange that it would eventually require the little grey cells of a small, extraordinary Belgian, then enjoying a quiet holiday some 30 miles distant, to unravel it. For it was in this same orchard, 2 mornings later, that Nathaniel Latimer's body would be found, and beside it, scratched into the soft earth, with what the doctor would later determine was his own dying hand, a single word that named no one, and yet, as Hastings would come to understand, named everything. Chapter 2. The Body in the Orchard. It was Diana who found him, and her scream, thin and high and utterly unlike her usual composed voice, brought the household running across the dew-wet lawn in various states of undress and alarm. Hastings, still in his dressing gown, reached the orchard wall perhaps 30 seconds behind Gerald, and what he saw there remained with him for the rest of his life in the particular clarity that shock lends to memory. Nathaniel Latimer lay on his back beneath the largest of the apple trees, one arm flung out across the grass, his face turned toward the pale morning sky with an expression that was not quite peaceful and not quite pained, but caught somewhere queerly between the two. His dressing gown, for he too, it seemed, had come out early and informally, was twisted beneath him, and there was a scattering of fallen apples around his feet, as though he had disturbed the tree in falling. Dr. Faraday arrived within minutes, dropping to his knees beside the body with the brisk economy of a man who has attended sudden death before, though perhaps never one quite so close to home. He worked for a long moment in silence, feeling for a pulse that was plainly not there, lifting an eyelid, and finally sitting back on his heels with a face gone the colour of ash. "He's been dead some hours," Faraday said. "Since before dawn, I should think, from the state of him. Heart, very likely. I've warned him a dozen times his ticker wouldn't stand much more strain, and God knows he gave it strain enough with that fool announcement last night." He paused, and something crossed his face that Hastings, looking back, would later identify as the first flicker of a doubt the doctor was not yet ready to voice. "Though I confess I should like to examine him more thoroughly before I commit myself to a certificate." It was Rupert Ainsworth, pale, correct, his solicitor's instincts apparently undimmed even by horror, who first noticed the marks in the soft earth beside the dead man's outstretched hand. "Look here," he said, and his voice had a strange, careful quality. Good Lord, he's written something." They gathered round, though Colonel Ashworth held Diana back with a firm hand on her shoulder, murmuring that a lady oughtn't to look too closely at such things. In the dark, crumbling earth of the orchard bed, scratched with what appeared to be a single trembling finger, was a mark, not, on first inspection, plainly a letter at all, but a curved, looping shape that might have been the beginning of a word, or might have been nothing more than the last involuntary spasm of a dying hand. "It looks rather like a C," said Gerald slowly. "Or perhaps the start of an O. Or an initial," said Rupert, in a voice that Hastings thought, even then, was pitched a shade too carefully neutral. Colonel Ashworth's face had gone the peculiar mottled colour of a man holding his temper, or his fear, under very tight control. "This is morbid speculation, and unhelpful besides. The man's had a seizure, poor devil, and grasped at the ground as any man might in his last agony. You'll make phantoms out of nothing if you go on like this." But it was Miss Celia Vane, standing a little apart with her arms wrapped about herself against the morning chill, who said the thing that none of the others quite dared to say aloud. "He's trying to tell us something," she said, very quietly. "Even now, even like this, he's trying to tell us who did it to him." The word hung in the cold morning air like a struck bell, and Hastings saw, in the space of that silence, 5 faces arrange themselves into 5 different kinds of stillness, and understood, with the sudden clarity of a man waking from a pleasant dream into an unpleasant reality, that not one of those faces could presently be trusted. The local constabulary arrived within the hour in the person of Inspector Reeves, a solid, unimaginative man, well suited to the ordinary business of poaching and petty theft, but entirely unprepared for what he found waiting for him beneath the apple trees of Thistlewood Hall. He examined the mark in the earth with a torch, though the sun was well up by then, made several notes in a small book, and pronounced himself unable to say with any certainty what the mark represented, or indeed whether it represented anything at all beyond the death throes of a stricken man. It was Dr. Faraday's private word to the inspector, overheard by Hastings, who had not meant to overhear it, but who found himself lingering near the orchard wall on some pretext of tidiness, that changed the character of the morning from tragedy to investigation. "I don't like the look of his eyes," Faraday said, low and urgent, "nor the state of his pupils. I've seen digitalis poisoning before, Inspector, and I don't say this is certainly that, but I don't say it isn't either. I should very much like a proper post-mortem before anyone in this house so much as touches his correspondence." Reeves's solid face had gone several degrees more solemn. "You're saying this might not be his heart giving out natural, Doctor?" "I am saying," said Faraday, with the particular precision of a professional man choosing his words to survive later scrutiny, "that I am not yet prepared to say it is." The remainder of that long, grey day passed at Thistlewood Hall in the peculiar suspended fashion that Hastings had come, over the years, to associate with houses where death has recently called but has not yet been properly named. Guests who might ordinarily have gone about their business, a walk to the village, a letter to be posted, a call paid upon a neighbour, found themselves instead confined to the drawing-room and the terrace, unwilling to be seen leaving, and equally unwilling to be seen too eager to remain. Inspector Reeves conducted a preliminary search of the orchard and the study with a thoroughness that owed more to conscientiousness than to any settled theory, while the household watched his comings and goings from behind curtains not quite fully drawn. Diana Latimer kept to her room for the greater part of the morning, and when she emerged at last for a late luncheon that nobody had much appetite for, her eyes were red-rimmed, but her composure otherwise remarkable. The composure, Hastings thought, of a woman who has decided that grief, however genuine, must not be permitted to unseat her entirely, while so many watchful eyes remained upon her. Colonel Ashworth, by contrast, drank rather more sherry before luncheon than the hour strictly warranted, and spoke, when he spoke at all, in the too hearty tones of a man determined to appear unaffected by circumstances that plainly affected him a great deal. It was Mrs. Hobbs, moving quietly about her duties with the particular dignity of a servant who has served a family through both its comfortable years and its difficult ones, who voiced to the assembled kitchen staff, and thereby, inevitably, to the greater part of the county within a day or two, the sentiment that would come to hang over the entire investigation like a pall, that whatever had happened beneath the apple trees that morning, It had happened at the hand of someone who had sat, smiling, at Mr. Latimer's own table not 12 hours before. And it was this careful, damning ambiguity, neither accusation nor reassurance, that sent Inspector Reeves, within the hour, to place a telephone call to a small, extraordinary Belgian gentleman who was known to be spending a quiet holiday at the Boar's Head in the neighbouring town of Lower Chetwynd, and who had, on more than one previous occasion, proved himself rather better acquainted with murder than the local police force cared to admit. Chapter 3. The Belgian stranger Hercule Poirot arrived at Thistlewood Hall a little after 3 that afternoon, in a hired motor car driven with what he considered reckless disregard for both his moustaches and his digestion, and stepped down onto the gravel drive with the particular fastidiousness of a man determined that murder should not be permitted to disarrange his appearance. He was, Hastings thought upon being introduced, for it transpired the two had met years before, in circumstances neither cared to summarize for the benefit of Inspector Reeves, a most improbable figure to inspire the confidence that Reeves so plainly placed in him, barely 5.5 feet in height, egg-shaped of head, with a moustache trained and waxed to a stiffness that seemed almost architectural, and a manner of speaking that mingled excellent English with an accent he had, in 30 years of residence, made not the slightest effort to soften. "Ah, Hastings, mon ami," he exclaimed, with every appearance of delight, as though they had met at a garden party rather than at the scene of a suspicious death. "But this is most fortunate. Or perhaps," he added, glancing about him at the sombre facade of the hall, "I should say most unfortunate, given the circumstances that bring us together. You are a guest in this house," Hastings explained, briefly, the connection through Gerald, and Poirot listened with his head tilted slightly to one side, in the attitude of a bird attending to a sound of particular interest. "Bien. Then you have observed these people before tragedy arranged their faces into the masks they now no doubt wear for the inspector's benefit. This is valuable, Hastings. The mask a person wears when they believe themselves unobserved tells Hercule Poirot a great deal more than the mask they compose for the police." Inspector Reeves, waiting with barely concealed impatience by the front steps, conducted Poirot directly to the orchard, where the body had by now been photographed and measured and was awaiting removal for post-mortem examination. Poirot approached the scene with small, mincing steps, his sharp eyes moving over the ground with a thoroughness that seemed almost comically at odds with his dapper appearance, until one understood, as Hastings had understood, years before, and had never quite ceased to marvel at, that nothing in Hercule Poirot's manner was without purpose. He knelt, with evident distaste for the state of his trousers, beside the mark in the earth, and studied it for a long moment without speaking. "You see it, Inspector? A letter, you think? A C, or perhaps an O begun and not completed?" "That was my thought, yes." "It is a natural thought," said Poirot, "and for that reason I mistrust it a little. The natural thought is very often the thought that someone has arranged for us to have. Tell me, Inspector, was the ground disturbed at all before this mark was discovered? Trodden upon, perhaps, by those who found the body?" Reeves consulted his notebook. "Miss Latimer found him. Then young Mr. Ainsworth and Mr. Gerald Latimer, close behind. I'm told they gathered round pretty close, before anyone thought to be careful of the ground." "Ah." Poirot's small eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Then we cannot be entirely certain, can we, that what we see now is precisely what was there when the last breath left him? A footprint here, a careless hand there. These things can alter a mark considerably, without anyone intending harm by it." He rose, brushing at his knees with an expression of some suffering. "I should like, Inspector, to speak with each member of this household in turn, and I should like Dr. Faraday's report on the post-mortem the very moment it is available. Digitalis, he suspects. This is a poison that does not act by accident, when a man's own doctor has been careful for months to regulate his dosage. You think it's murder, then? Already, without a word spoken to any of them?" Poirot regarded the inspector with the faintly pitying expression he reserved for those who mistook caution for uncertainty. Inspector, a man does not scratch a mark into the earth with his dying hand because his heart has failed him naturally. A man does that because something, or someone, has been done to him, and some fragment of will remains to protest it. Whether that mark tells us a name, I do not yet know, but that it tells us murder, of this I am already tolerably certain. He turned then to survey the house, its crooked chimneys, its ivied walls, its many watching windows, with the expression of a general surveying a battlefield, not yet fully mapped. Come, Hastings, we will take tea with these good people, and I will watch their hands as they hold their cups, and their eyes as they avoid mine, and by such small things, mon ami, we will begin to understand who among them found it necessary that Nathaniel Latimer should die before Thursday came, and his new will with it. The tea, when it came, was taken in the long drawing-room with its faded Turkey carpet and its portraits of Latimer's long dead, and Hastings, watching as Poirot had instructed him to watch, found himself struck by how very ordinary the scene appeared, and how very extraordinary that ordinariness now seemed, given what lay beneath it. Colonel Ashworth talked a great deal, and rather too loudly, of regimental days in India, as though volume alone might hold at bay the questions he plainly dreaded. Dr. Faraday drank his tea in 3 brisk swallows, and excused himself early, murmuring something about correspondence that required his attention. Gerald sat close by his cousin Diana, offering her small, wordless kindnesses, the passing of a plate, the refilling of a cup, with the quiet solicitude of a man who did not know what comfort to offer in words, and had settled, sensibly enough, for offering it in gestures instead. It was Poirot himself, rather than any deliberate stratagem, who drew the household's attention to the very question that most concerned him, remarking with apparent innocence upon a handsome ring worn by Gerald, "A family piece, monsieur? I have always had a fondness for the small heraldic vanities of the English gentry, so much more restrained than our own continental fashions," and receiving in reply a scattering of answers that told him, in the space of 5 idle minutes, precisely which gentleman present wore such rings, and which did not, without a single person in the room suspecting that anything of significance had passed between them at all. "You see, Hastings," he murmured later, as they walked back toward the village in the gathering dusk, "how much may be learned over teacups that could never be extracted across an interrogation table. A man watches his words when he knows himself questioned. He forgets to watch his hands when he believes himself merely making conversation." Chapter 4. Little Grey Cells at Work. The library at Thistlewood Hall, chosen by Poirot as the scene of his interviews for its good north light and its distance from the orchard's disquieting proximity, had been arranged with a small table and 2 chairs positioned, Hastings noted, so that whoever sat opposite Poirot would face the window, their features fully illuminated, while Poirot himself remained in comfortable shadow. Gerald Latimer came first, awkward and grieving in the particular manner of a young man unaccustomed to either sentiment or suspicion. "I loved him, you know," Gerald said, twisting his signet ring. A plain gold band, Hastings noted, quite unremarkable, round and round upon his finger. Difficult old devil that he was. I don't say I always agreed with him, or that his new will didn't worry me rather. A man doesn't like to think his position in the world might be quite different come Thursday than it was on Tuesday. But I never wished him dead, Monsieur Poirot. Never that. "And where were you, Monsieur Latimer, between the hours of 4 and 6 yesterday evening?" "In the billiard-room, mostly. Ashworth will confirm it. We played 2 frames, and I lost both, as I generally do." A faint, unhappy smile. "Then I went up to dress for dinner about 6:30. Poirot made a small note and thanked him, and called for Colonel Ashworth, who entered with the over-hearty stride of a man determined to appear entirely at his ease. "Damned unpleasant business," the colonel began, before Poirot had asked a single question. "Known Nathaniel 30 years. India, you know, the old regiment days, and I'll tell you frankly, Poirot, whatever tittle-tattle you've heard about debts and IOUs, I'd no more have harmed the man than I'd have shot my own horse." "I have heard no tittle-tattle, Colonel," said Poirot mildly. though I thank you for informing me that such tittle-tattle exists. Perhaps you would care to tell me yourself what it concerns, before I am obliged to hear a less generous version from another source." The colonel's mottled flush returned, but he answered readily enough, too readily, Hastings thought, as though he had rehearsed the confession in advance and was glad to have it over. There was, it seemed, a debt of some £400, incurred at cards some years before and never wholly repaid, which Nathaniel had held over him, not maliciously, the colonel insisted, but as a private joke between old friends, a thing referred to at dinner tables, to needle him gently. But a joke's a joke, and £400 is £400, and I'll not pretend I wasn't relieved to think the new will might have cancelled the debt along with everything else. That's honest, and you may make of it what you will. Diana Latimer's interview, conducted a little later that same afternoon, was the briefest and in some ways the most affecting of the day. She sat very upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and answered Poirot's questions with a steadiness that seemed to cost her a visible effort. "I found him, you know," she said, before Poirot had asked anything at all. "I don't imagine you'll let me forget it, and I don't particularly wish to forget it myself. He was my uncle, whatever his faults, and I loved him, and I shall carry the picture of him lying there for the rest of my life. I am sorry to cause you further distress, mademoiselle, but I must ask, where were you between 4 o'clock and 5:30 on the evening he died?" "In my room, resting. I had a headache. I get them sometimes, when I'm anxious, and I confess I was anxious that evening, after Uncle Nathaniel's announcement at dinner the night before. Ellen brought my bath-water at 5:15, and I imagine she'll tell you I was there when she came, which is the only proof I can offer you, and I'm aware it isn't much of one. And your feelings, mademoiselle, regarding the new will. You had learned, I think, that your own inheritance was to be reduced considerably." Something flickered across her face. Not guilt, Poirot thought, but a weary, resigned unhappiness that had evidently been sitting with her for some days already. "I knew there were to be changes. I didn't know the particulars until Mr. Pemberton told you all of them, no more than the others did. I'll be honest with you, Monsieur Poirot, because I don't see what's gained by pretending otherwise. It worried me. Rupert and I are to be married, and a solicitor's income isn't a fortune, and I had rather counted, in a quiet way I'm not proud of, on my uncle's money to see us comfortably started. But I would have married Rupert with nothing at all sooner than see any harm come to Uncle Nathaniel, and I hope you will believe that, whatever the arithmetic of the thing suggests to you." Poirot inclined his head with a gentleness that Hastings noted with some surprise, for his friend was not, as a rule, given to visible tenderness in the course of an interrogation. "I believe you, mademoiselle, for whatever that assurance may presently be worth to you. Grief such as yours is not easily counterfeited, and I have seen a great deal of both the genuine and the false article in my time." Dr. Faraday, when his turn came, was crisper and more clinical, as befitted his profession, though Poirot noted, and remarked upon later to Hastings, a certain tightness about the mouth when the subject of Miss Vane arose.
"My professional relationship with Mr. Latimer was purely that. Professional," Faraday said, a shade too firmly.
"I prescribed his digitalis, monitored his heart, advised him, repeatedly, and largely in vain, against excitement and rich food. That his death should come from an overdose of the very medicine meant to preserve him is, I confess, a bitter irony I had not anticipated." "You are certain, then, that it was an overdose, and not simply his heart failing, as it might have failed on any evening?" "The post-mortem will confirm it or deny it, Monsieur Poirot, and I should prefer to say no more until it does. I am a careful man. I do not like to guess where facts will shortly be available." "It was," Poirot observed to Hastings afterward, as they took a turn about the garden before dinner, "a very correct answer, and a very cautious one, and caution, in his experience, was worn by the guilty and the merely careful in almost identical fashion, which made it, for the present, of very little use to him." "But you have noticed something, all the same," Hastings said, for he knew his friend well enough by now to read the particular stillness that settled over him when a thought had taken hold. I have noticed several somethings, mon ami. I have noticed that Colonel Ashworth confessed his debt before I asked for it, which is either the honesty of an innocent man or the cleverness of a guilty one who prefers to choose his own moment for confession. I have noticed that Dr. Faraday's caution is very correctly worn, like a coat cut a size too careful. And I have noticed— He paused beside a late rose and regarded it with every appearance of botanical interest— that not one of these gentlemen has yet mentioned Mademoiselle Vane's name without being asked for it directly. In a household so recently disturbed by talk of a new will made substantially in her favour, this restraint interests me a great deal. Chapter 5. The Will That Never Was. Mr. Aubrey Pemberton proved to be a dry, precise little man, entirely unsuited by temperament to the drama that had engulfed his client's household, and he answered Poirot's questions with the flat, careful diction of a man reading from a brief. I had drawn the new will in draft only, Monsieur Poirot. It was to be executed, signed and properly witnessed, on Thursday morning before I returned to Bristol. As matters stand, it was never signed. The estate passes, therefore, under the terms of Mr. Latimer's previous will, executed some 6 years ago. And the terms of this previous will? Divided, in the main, between Mr. Gerald Latimer and Miss Diana Latimer, with a modest legacy to Colonel Ashworth and a smaller provision for the servants. Miss Vane is not mentioned in it at all. She had, of course, entered Mr. Latimer's acquaintance only within the last year. And the new will, the one that was never signed, what did it propose? Here Pemberton hesitated, with the particular reluctance of a solicitor, asked to disclose a confidence that death had rendered, technically, no longer confidential. It proposed a very substantial legacy to Miss Vane, some £40,000, along with the smaller cottage on the estate, and a correspondingly reduced provision for Mr. Gerald and Miss Diana. Colonel Ashworth's legacy was to be cancelled outright, the debt of honour called in as a deduction against it. Dr. Faraday was to receive nothing beyond his professional fees, which I understand had disappointed him, as Mr. Latimer had at one time spoken of a bequest in recognition of his care. Poirot's small eyes had grown very bright indeed. So, under the will that was never signed, 4 people stood to lose a great deal, and one, Mademoiselle Vane, stood to gain a fortune. And yet it is the will that was never signed that governs the estate, which means that Mademoiselle Vane, whatever her hopes, gains nothing at all by Mr. Latimer's death, quite the reverse, while the 4 who stood to lose under the new will find themselves, by his convenient dying before Thursday, restored entirely to their former expectations. That is a correct summary, yes, said Pemberton, with the air of a man relieved to have arrived at a fact rather than a supposition. Tell me, Monsieur Pemberton, did anyone in this house know, before yesterday evening's dinner, the specific terms of this new will, or only that changes were contemplated? That I cannot say with certainty. I had discussed the draft with Mr. Latimer alone in his study on several occasions this past week, and I took some care that the details should not become general knowledge before the signing. It was Mr. Latimer's own wish, in fact, that the family should not know precisely how the pudding was to be sliced, as he rather colourfully put it to me, until the matter was settled beyond dispute. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And yet, Monsieur Pemberton, a study is not a vault. Documents left upon a desk, drafts placed carelessly in a drawer, a conversation half overheard through a door not quite closed. These things happen in the best regulated households, n'est-ce pas? Was there any occasion, however brief, when the draft will might have been read by someone other than yourself and your client? Pemberton's dry face creased with the effort of honest recollection. There was one occasion, Tuesday evening, I believe, when I left the draft upon the study desk while Mr. Latimer and I took a short turn in the garden after dinner. We were gone perhaps 20 minutes. I could not swear that the room remained unvisited in that time. 20 minutes, Poirot repeated softly, is ample time for a man to read a document that concerns his own ruin, mon ami, and to begin, in the privacy of his own mind, to consider what might be done about it. Later, walking the gravel paths with Hastings in the fading light, Poirot was unusually quiet, turning the fact of the unsigned will over in his mind with evident dissatisfaction. "You are troubled," Hastings observed. "I am troubled, Hastings, because the unsigned will tells us a motive that applies to 4 people at once, which is very nearly as useless as a motive that applies to none. Ashworth loses his cancelled legacy restored. Gerald and Diana lose their reduced shares restored. Faraday loses his hoped-for bequest, though that was never formally promised him, and so scarcely counts as loss at all. Any one of the 4 had reason to prefer that Mr. Latimer die before Thursday rather than after it. It is the mark in the earth, I think, that must narrow this circle for us. If only I can persuade it to yield its secret before the guilty party has further opportunity to arrange the evidence to their liking." Hastings said nothing for a while, matching his stride to his friend's shorter one as they walked on beneath the darkening elms that lined the drive. It struck him, not for the first time in their long acquaintance, how strange a thing it was that murder should so often turn upon matters as dry and unromantic as trust deeds and legacies, and the precise wording of a document not yet signed, and how very far removed such calculations seemed from the passionate, disordered business of taking a fellow creature's life. "Doesn't it trouble you, Poirot?" he said at last. "How coldly these people can speak of money, with the old man barely a day in his grave, Ashworth fretting over his £400, Pemberton reciting figures like a man reading out a grocer's bill. It seems almost indecent. It seems so to you, mon ami, because you are a man of warm and generous instincts, who has never in his life needed to calculate quite so precisely what he might lose. But I have found, in a long career of such matters, that necessity does not wait upon good taste. A man facing ruin does not have the luxury of grieving prettily before he addresses the arithmetic of his own survival. And it is very often in that ugly, hurried arithmetic, Hastings, rather than in any grand passion, that the true motive for murder is finally to be found. We are not looking, in this case, for a crime of hatred or of jealousy. We are looking for a crime of arithmetic, a sum that would not balance, and a person desperate enough to alter the figures by whatever means remain to them. Chapter 6. Colonel Ashworth's Debt. It was Hastings, prowling the village the following morning on an errand for tobacco, who fell into conversation with the landlord of the Fox and Hounds, and returned to the hall with a piece of information he considered, rightly, as it transpired, worth bringing at once to Poirot's attention. Ashworth's been losing at cards rather badly these last months, apparently, and not just to Latimer. Fellow at the pub says he's into half the county for one sum or another, and there was talk not long ago of his creditors growing impatient. If that £400 to Latimer was the least of his troubles, Poirot, he's in deeper water than he let on. Poirot received this with evident satisfaction, in the manner of a man to whom a useful fact has been delivered rather sooner than he had dared hope. This confirms what I suspected from his manner of confession, Hastings. A man does not volunteer a debt of £400 so readily unless he fears a debt of considerably more being discovered in its place. Let us call again upon the good Colonel, and this time I shall ask him not what he owes Mr. Latimer, but what he owes everyone else besides. Confronted, Colonel Ashworth's bluster collapsed with the suddenness of a poorly built dam. He admitted, after some minutes of unhappy circling, that his total debts ran to nearer £2,000, spread across several creditors of varying patience, and that the cancellation of Nathaniel's 400 would have done very little to solve his difficulties, a fact which he offered, with some desperation, as proof of his innocence, rather than evidence against it. "Don't you see, man, if I'd meant to kill him for money, I'd have needed a great deal more than £400 forgiven. It solves nothing. I'm still ruined, new will or old, unless I can raise the full sum within the month." "Unless," said Poirot gently, "you had reason to believe some other source of funds might shortly become available to you. Tell me, Colonel, were you aware that Mr. Latimer's previous will provided you a legacy that the new will proposed to cancel entirely?" The Colonel's face, already flushed, went a shade paler. "Yes. He told me himself, some weeks back, more as a threat than information, I always thought. Said if I didn't mend my ways, he'd see I got not a penny of it. Then under the will that governs the estate, as matters presently stand, the will that was never signed, you receive nothing. But under the old will, still in force because Mr. Latimer died before Thursday, you receive your legacy in full. This is a very considerable motive, Colonel Ashworth, and I think you understand it as well as I do. The Colonel's hands, Hastings noticed, had begun to tremble very slightly upon his knees. I didn't do it, Poirot. Whatever the arithmetic tells you, I didn't do it. I was in the billiard room with young Gerald till gone 6:30, and after that I was dressing for dinner, and you may ask my man Prentice if you doubt it. He'll tell you I never left my room. Prentice, the Colonel's man, confirmed the account when questioned that same afternoon, with the stiff, unwavering loyalty of a servant who has weathered his master's difficulties for many years and has long since ceased to be surprised by them. He had laid out the Colonel's evening clothes at 5:30, he said, and had been in and out of the dressing-room on various small errands until nearly 6:45, and could swear before any court in the land that Colonel Ashworth had not once left that room in all the time between. And was the Colonel in good spirits, Prentice, during this time? Anything in his manner that struck you as unusual? He was quiet, sir, which isn't always his way, but I put that down to the will business troubling him, same as it seemed to trouble most everyone in the house that evening. He asked me once, sir, whether I thought Mr. Latimer a man likely to forgive a debt out of sentiment, and I told him I couldn't rightly say, not being privy to Mr. Latimer's private feelings, and he laughed rather sadly and said he supposed not. I shall ask him, said Poirot, with the mild courtesy of a man who intends to do precisely that, and very soon. In the meantime, Colonel, I should be interested to know one further thing. Do you wear, or have you ever worn, a signet ring bearing any manner of crest or monogram? The question, so apparently irrelevant, produced in the Colonel an expression of pure bewilderment that Hastings, watching closely, as Poirot had taught him to do, found entirely convincing. A signet ring? No, never worn one in my life. Can't abide jewellery on a man, myself. Why the devil do you ask? For reasons, said Poirot, rising and gathering his hat. That will become clear to you, Colonel, at the appropriate moment, and not one instant before. Chapter 7. The Mark in the Earth. That afternoon, with Inspector Reeves's grudging permission and a photograph of the disturbed earth taken before any further weather or footsteps could alter it, Poirot settled himself at the library table with the print before him, a magnifying glass, and an expression of intense concentration that Hastings had learned, over the years, not to interrupt. "Consider it with me, Hastings," Poirot said at last, beckoning him closer. "A dying man, his strength failing with every second, reaches out and scratches a mark into soft earth. He has, we may suppose, perhaps 10 or 15 seconds of purposeful movement left to him before consciousness departs entirely. What does a man do with such seconds? He does not, I think, embark upon an elaborate signature. He makes the smallest, most essential mark that will convey his meaning, and he trusts, poor soul, that someone with sufficient intelligence will later understand it. It does look like a C, Hastings offered, peering at the photograph. Or the beginning of an O, as Gerald said. It looks like a C to a mind that expects to find a letter, mon ami, because the mind that expects a thing will very often find it, whether or not it is truly there. But consider, a man does not always think, in his last extremity, in terms of the alphabet at all. Consider a man who has spent 40 years in the business of insurance, assessing claims, verifying identities, examining the small distinguishing marks by which one thing is known from another that superficially resembles it. Such a man's mind, I think, does not reach first for letters. It reaches for marks, the kind of mark that appears on a signet ring, a family crest, a maker's stamp upon a piece of silver. The habits of 40 years do not desert a man even as he is dying, Hastings. If anything, I think, they assert themselves more strongly than ever, precisely because conscious thought has grown too slow and uncertain to override them. Hastings frowned at the photograph with renewed attention. You think he wasn't trying to write a letter at all? You think he was trying to draw something he'd seen? I think it is a possibility we have not yet properly examined, and until we have examined it, I do not think we should permit ourselves to be too comfortable with the letter C. Poirot traced the curve on the photograph with the tip of his pencil, not touching the print itself, but hovering just above it. See how the mark curves back upon itself here, and again here. Twice, Hastings, not once. A letter C requires only a single curve, but a crest, an emblem, a monogram of two interlocking letters. Such a thing might very well produce two curves, imperfectly rendered by a hand already failing, before the hand itself failed entirely. Hastings studied the photograph a while longer, turning it this way and that, as though a fresh angle might yield some new certainty. But surely, Poirot, if he'd seen a face, his killer's face, I mean, wouldn't a name be the more natural thing to try and record? Why a symbol at all, when a name would serve so much more plainly? Because, mon ami, I do not think he saw a face clearly in that final moment. Or if he did, I think the shock and the failing of his own body had already begun to rob him of the ordinary faculties by which a face becomes, in the mind, a name. Think of how such a poison works upon a man, the heart labouring, the breath short, the very thoughts themselves growing sluggish and confused even as some deeper, more automatic part of the mind continues to function. A name requires the ordinary machinery of memory and language, both of which fail early in such a crisis. But a mark, an object, a shape pressed physically against the skin, this the hand may attempt to copy, almost without the mind's conscious participation at all, in the same way that a man startled from sleep may fumble for a lamp, switch his fingers know by long habit, though his waking mind has not yet properly assembled itself. It is, if you permit the comparison, Hastings, rather like a wounded animal that flees toward its den by instinct, long after conscious thought has ceased to guide its legs. It's a horrible thing to think about, Hastings said quietly, a man's very last instinct being to record evidence, like some kind of walking insurance ledger. It is horrible, yes, but it is also, I think, rather magnificent, and it is why I have very little patience, Hastings, for those who suggest that a dying man's final gesture is too unreliable a thing to build a case upon. Nathaniel Latimer spent his whole life training his mind to notice what others overlooked. I do not think death itself was quite strong enough to entirely undo 40 years of such discipline in the handful of seconds allotted to him. An interlocking monogram, Hastings repeated slowly, like initials, two letters, wound together. Precisely so, mon ami. And this is why I asked the good colonel about his signet ring, and received in reply the most convincing bewilderment I have encountered in some days. For a man who does not own such a ring cannot very well be troubled by the question, and his bewilderment, unlike his account of his card debts, cost him nothing to display honestly. Poirot sat back, steepling his fingers. I think, Hastings, we must now inquire rather more closely into the jewellery worn by every person in this house on the evening Mr. Latimer died, not as a matter of fashion, but as a matter of murder. Chapter 8. Whispers Below Stairs. It was Hastings's own suggestion, offered with some pride, for he did not often anticipate his friend's methods successfully, that the servants of Thistlewood Hall, who saw a great deal and were asked their opinion very little, might prove a richer source of small facts than the family upstairs had so far provided. Poirot agreed with flattering promptness, and the two of them spent a companionable hour in the housekeeper's sitting-room, where tea was produced and tongues, warmed by the novelty of being consulted, loosened considerably. Mrs. Hobbs, the housekeeper, recalled that Mr. Latimer had taken his usual glass of whisky and water in the study at about 5 o'clock, as was his invariable custom before dressing for dinner, a fact already known, but usefully confirmed. More interesting was her recollection that the tray, when she came to collect it later, had been moved from its accustomed place on the desk to a side table near the window, which wasn't like him at all, sir. He was a creature of habit and didn't care for things shifted about. The under-housemaid, a nervous girl named Ellen, contributed the detail, offered reluctantly and only after considerable reassurance, that she had seen Mr. Ainsworth coming out of Mr. Latimer's study at a little past 5, though she had thought nothing of it at the time, as gentlemen were forever going in and out of that room on one errand or another. "Are you quite certain of the time, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, very gently, for the girl's nervousness suggested she might retreat entirely from her own recollection if pressed too hard. "Near enough, sir. I remember because I was taking up the hot water for Miss Diana's bath, and that's always at 5:15, regular as clockwork, and Mr. Ainsworth near knocked the can from my hands, coming out so quick and not looking where he was going." "And did he say anything to you? Appear distressed or in any particular hurry?" "He apologized very proper, sir, same as always. Mr. Ainsworth's always civil, whatever else you might say of him. But he did look, I don't rightly know how to put it, like a man who'd had a fright, if you take my meaning, white about the mouth." This small fact, delivered so hesitantly, produced in Poirot an expression of quiet but unmistakable satisfaction, and he thanked Ellen with a warmth that sent her back to her duties considerably comforted regarding the propriety of having spoken at all. "You see, Hastings," he said, once they were private again, "how the servants' hall so often knows what the drawing-room labours to conceal. Mr. Ainsworth was in that study at a little past 5, within the very hour that Mr. Latimer took his whisky, and he emerged, by young Ellen's account, in a state that a housemaid, untrained in the subtleties of the drawing-room, described with the plain honesty of white about the mouth. This is not proof, mon ami, but it is a thread, and I think it is a thread we must follow with some care. There was, besides, the matter of the whisky tray itself, upon which Poirot pressed the butler, Simmons, at some length. Simmons was a stately, unhurried man of the old school, who plainly considered any discussion of his master's private habits to border upon impropriety, but who answered, under Poirot's patient and courteous persistence, with the exactness of a man determined that his professional conscience should have nothing to reproach him with. "Mr. Latimer's whisky and water was prepared by myself, sir, at 5 o'clock precisely, and carried to the study, where I left it upon his desk, as was customary. I did not remain in the room, sir. It was not my place to hover, and Mr. Latimer disliked being hovered over, as I believe most gentlemen do." "And the study door, was it left open or closed when you departed?" "Closed, sir, though not locked. Mr. Latimer rarely locked that door before dinner. He said a locked door in one's own house looked like distrust of one's own family, and he'd not have it, whatever Pemberton advised him about safeguarding his papers. So that any person in the house, Simmons, might have entered that study between 5 o'clock, when you left the tray, and whatever hour Mr. Latimer himself returned to drink from it, without exciting particular remark." "That is so, sir, though I should say most of the family had their own occupations at that hour, and a person seen loitering near the study without good cause would, I think, have been noticed by someone, even if not by myself." "Unless," said Poirot softly, "that person had very good cause indeed to be in that part of the house, a matter of trust business, say, requiring a private word with Mr. Latimer before dinner, in which case no one, Simmons, would have thought to remark upon it at all." Chapter 9. The Painter's Secret. Miss Celia Vane received Poirot in the small sitting-room she had made her own during her extended stay at the Hall, a room cluttered pleasantly with half-finished canvases and the particular disorder of a working, rather than merely decorative, artistic temperament. "I suppose you've come to ask whether I meant to marry him," she said, before Poirot had properly seated himself, with the directness of a woman who had decided that frankness would serve her better than delicacy. "Everyone thinks it, and nobody's had the courage to ask me outright, so I may as well save you the trouble of working up to it." "I would be most grateful, mademoiselle, if you would save me the trouble." "Then no, I did not mean to marry Nathaniel Latimer, and he did not, whatever the servants may have gossiped, ask me to. What he did offer, and what I had in fact accepted, in principle, before Tuesday, was patronage, a sum to fund an exhibition of my work in London, and a small annuity besides, in recognition of what he called, rather grandly, my artistic promise. He was a lonely old man who liked the company of someone who didn't want anything from him but conversation and the occasional honest opinion of his rose garden, and I liked him rather better than his own family gives me credit for. And the sum of £40,000 mentioned in the new will, mademoiselle, this also was patronage, in your understanding. Celia's composure faltered, very slightly, for the first time in the interview. I didn't know the figure. He never discussed particulars with me, said it was between himself and Pemberton, and none of my affair until it was settled. If it was really £40,000, Monsieur Poirot, then I promise you I am as astonished as anyone in this house, and rather more uncomfortable about it, given how it looks now that he's dead. Poirot regarded her steadily. You understand, of course, that under the will now in force, the earlier will, since the new one was never signed, you receive nothing whatever from Mr. Latimer's estate. His death, far from benefiting you, has cost you a great deal. I understand it very well, and I've had rather a lot of time to think about the unfairness of it, lying awake last night. I liked him, Monsieur Poirot, genuinely, not for his money, whatever the family chooses to believe. I'd rather have had my exhibition and my annuity and Nathaniel alive to be difficult about my brushwork for another 20 years than this. Her voice caught, and she turned toward the window to compose herself. Poirot allowed the silence to settle before he spoke again. Mademoiselle, I must ask you one further thing, and I ask you to consider your answer carefully. You have spent some months in this household, observing its members with the eye of one trained to observe. Have you noticed anything? A gesture, a habit, a small vanity, regarding jewelry worn by any of the gentlemen here? A ring, perhaps, bearing some manner of crest or device? Celia turned back, frowning in thought, and for a long moment Hastings thought she would say she recalled nothing at all. Then her frown cleared, replaced by an expression of dawning and uneasy recollection. There is one thing, she said slowly. Rupert wears a signet ring, his mother's family crest, he told me once, when I admired it and asked to sketch it for a portrait study. He was oddly reluctant, now I think of it, though he let me look at it closely enough at the time. 2 letters, intertwined, an R and an A, though worked so ornately that unless you knew what you were looking for, you might mistake it for almost any shape at all. You are quite certain of this, mademoiselle? It is a small thing to have remembered so precisely, from a single casual glance, some weeks or months ago. I am an artist, Monsieur Poirot, whatever else I may be, and a good one. You needn't take my word for that. You may judge my canvases yourself if you've a mind to. I notice shapes the way other people notice faces, and I remember them the same way. I asked Rupert once, quite lightly, whether I might sketch the ring for a study I was making of hands. I'd thought it rather a handsome piece of work in its way, and he refused, rather more sharply than the request seemed to warrant, and changed the subject so quickly that I confess I thought it odd at the time, though I didn't trouble myself over it further. People have their small vanities and their small secrets, and I've learned not to pry into either. You have been most helpful, mademoiselle, and I thank you for a frankness that I suspect has cost you something to give, given the affection in which you appear to hold Mr. Ainsworth's fiancée. Celia's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. Diana has been kinder to me than her cousin, or her uncle's other guests, if I'm honest. She never once made me feel the awkwardness of my position here, artist and outsider both. I should be glad to be wrong about all of this, Monsieur Poirot, for her sake more than my own, but I don't think you've come to me tonight because you expect to be told you're wrong. Poirot said nothing to this, which was, in its way, answer enough. Chapter 10. A Question of Time. Armed with this new and vital thread, Poirot spent the better part of the following morning reconstructing, with Inspector Reeves's assistance, the precise movements of every person in the house between 4 o'clock and 6:30 on the evening of Nathaniel Latimer's death. The window, Dr. Faraday's post-mortem report had now confirmed, within which the fatal dose of digitalis must have been administered. Gerald Latimer and Colonel Ashworth accounted for one another satisfactorily in the billiard room until 6:30, a fact independently confirmed by the butler, who had brought them whiskey at 5 and again at 6, and could swear to their continued presence on both occasions. Dr. Faraday had been engaged, by his own account and that of Mrs. Hobbs, in a lengthy telephone consultation regarding another patient from 4:30 until nearly 6, conducted from the small telephone room off the hall, within sight of the housekeeper's pantry for the greater part of that time. Diana Latimer had been resting in her room with a headache from 4 until Ellen brought her bath water at 5:15, and thereafter dressing for dinner, a period for which only her own word and the general unlikelihood of a devoted niece poisoning her own uncle could presently vouch. Celia Vane had been in the garden, sketching the last of the autumn roses, from shortly after 4 until nearly 5:30, a fact confirmed by the gardener, who had exchanged a few words with her regarding the state of a diseased standard rose near the sundial. Rupert Ainsworth's account, when Poirot pressed him directly, proved considerably less satisfactory than the others. "I was in the study with Mr. Latimer briefly, yes, sometime after 5, discussing a small matter of business, nothing to do with the will, I assure you. Then I went to my room to dress." "A small matter of business," Poirot repeated. "Concerning what, precisely, Monsieur Ainsworth? I hardly think that's relevant to your inquiry. You will permit me, monsieur, to be the judge of relevance in a matter of murder. What business had you with Mr. Latimer, alone, in the hour before he died?" Rupert's carefully correct solicitor's face had gone rigid with the effort of control. It concerned a trust matter, funds held on behalf of a client, in which Mr. Latimer had some interest as a co-trustee. "It is a confidential matter, Monsieur Poirot, protected by professional privilege, and I do not intend to discuss it further until I have taken advice on the point." "A most interesting position for an innocent man to adopt," Poirot observed mildly, "when the alternative is simply to explain himself and be done with it. But we will let it rest, monsieur, for the present, though I do not think, when Mr. Pemberton has finished examining certain ledgers I have asked him to produce, that the matter will remain confidential for very much longer." Rupert rose without another word and left the library with the stiff, careful gait of a man walking a very fine line indeed, and Hastings, watching him go, felt an unaccustomed pang of something close to pity, quickly suppressed. "You suspect him already, don't you?" Hastings said, once the door had closed. "Quite firmly, I mean, not merely as one possibility among several. I suspect him a great deal, mon ami, though suspicion and proof are two very different garments, and I do not care to send a man to trial dressed only in the first of them. Consider what we presently have: a man who was alone with the victim near the hour of the poisoning, who grew visibly distressed in the aftermath, who refuses on grounds of privilege to explain a private business that may very well conceal a motive of the gravest kind, and who wears, moreover, a ring that could plausibly account for the mark left in the earth. It is a great deal of smoke, Hastings, for there to be no fire beneath it at all. But I have been wrong before, not often, I confess, but often enough to have learned humility from the experience, and I will not name a murderer to Inspector Reeves until the ledgers Monsieur Pemberton is presently examining have told me whether my smoke conceals the fire I suspect, or some other fire entirely that I have not yet considered. Chapter 11. The Solicitor's Ledger. Mr. Pemberton returned to the library the following afternoon with the particular grey pallor of a professional man who has discovered, within his own trusted circle, a betrayal of the standards by which his entire profession sets such store. "I have spent the morning examining the trust accounts Mr. Ainsworth mentioned, Monsieur Poirot, at your request. The Kavanagh Trust, of which he and Mr. Latimer were joint trustees, established some years ago for the benefit of a young ward now approaching her majority." He laid a slim folder upon the table, with the reluctance of a man surrendering evidence against a colleague. I regret to say the accounts do not balance. Some £3,000 appears to have been withdrawn against the trust over the past 18 months, in sums too small and too irregular to have attracted immediate notice, but entirely unaccounted for by any legitimate disbursement I can identify. And these withdrawals were authorized by whose signature? By Mr. Ainsworth's alone, in each instance. Mr. Latimer's countersignature, which the trust deed requires for sums above a certain figure, appears in every case to have been, I use the word with great reluctance, Monsieur Poirot, forged. Poorly forged, in fact, once one knows to look closely. I do not think it would have escaped detection very much longer had matters continued on their present course. And the ward comes into her majority. When, precisely? Within the month, at which point the trust must be formally wound up, its accounts audited and presented for her inspection, as the trust deed requires. Poirot's small eyes had taken on the particular brightness that Hastings had learned to associate with the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. So, Mr. Ainsworth finds himself, some weeks ago, facing a reckoning he cannot survive. £3,000 embezzled from a trust of which he is joint guardian, an audit approaching that cannot be postponed or deceived, and no honest means of repairing the deficit before it is discovered. He is engaged to marry Miss Diana Latimer, whose inheritance, under the existing will, would go some way toward covering such a sum, discreetly, before the audit falls due. And then, quite suddenly, he learns, perhaps by reading a draft document left carelessly upon a study desk while its author took a turn about the garden, that a new will is about to substantially reduce Miss Diana's inheritance in favor of a lady to whom he owes nothing whatever. "You believe he read the draft that Tuesday evening," said Pemberton slowly, "when I left it unattended for those 20 minutes. I believe it explains a great deal that has otherwise resisted explanation, monsieur. A man facing exposure and ruin does not always act with careful calculation. He acts, very often, with the desperate improvisation of a drowning man who has seen, quite suddenly, a single plank floating within reach. Mr. Ainsworth needed Diana's inheritance intact, and he needed it before Thursday, when the new will would place it forever beyond salvage. Nathaniel Latimer's heart medicine, prescribed by Dr. Faraday, and no doubt familiar to any observant guest of this household, offered a means that might, with fortune, pass entirely for natural causes. "But surely," Hastings put in, "if he'd meant it to pass for natural causes, he wouldn't have gone anywhere near the orchard afterward. He'd have simply let matters take their course." "Ah, but consider, Hastings, a man who has just administered poison to another does not, as a rule, calmly retire to bed and trust entirely to fortune. He watches. He waits to be certain the dose has taken proper effect. And perhaps, though this I cannot yet prove, he followed Mr. Latimer when the old man, feeling the first symptoms of distress, went out into the orchard for air, as I understand, was sometimes his habit when unwell. And there, mon ami, in the last moments of Nathaniel Latimer's life, something occurred that Mr. Ainsworth had not anticipated at all. The dying man saw him, Hastings said slowly, saw his ring. I believe so, yes. I believe Nathaniel Latimer, dying and perhaps only half conscious of what was happening to him, reached out in some final instinctive gesture, to steady himself perhaps, or to grasp at the man standing over him, and in that gesture, his hand closed for a moment upon Rupert Ainsworth's own, and upon the ring it bore. And I believe that Nathaniel Latimer, a man trained by 40 years in the insurance trade to notice precisely such identifying marks, used the last purposeful movement left to him, not to write a name he perhaps no longer had the clarity of mind to compose, but to sketch, as best his failing hand allowed, the shape of the crest he had just seen and felt, pressed against his own dying palm. Pemberton sat for a long moment in silence, turning his own thin hands over in his lap, as though examining them for some flaw he had only just discovered. "I have known Rupert Ainsworth since he was a pupil in my own office, Monsieur Poirot. I recommended him for the Kavanagh trusteeship myself, some years back, and thought him honest as the day is long. It is a sobering thing to discover how little one truly knows of a man one has watched grow into his profession. It is the great tragedy of your profession, monsieur, as it is of mine, that trust, once given, is so very rarely withdrawn until it is already too late to matter. But I would ask you not to judge yourself too harshly for it. A forger who is skilled enough to deceive an audit for 18 months is skilled enough, very often, to deceive an old friend for a good deal longer than that. What ought I to do now, Monsieur Poirot? The trust accounts must be reported, of course, whatever the personal cost to the family. But I confess I do not relish being the instrument of Miss Diana's further unhappiness, on top of everything else she is presently obliged to bear. You must do your duty, monsieur, as I must do mine, and as, I think, Nathaniel Latimer would have wished you to do, whatever grief it causes in the short term. A trust betrayed and left unspoken becomes in time a wound that never properly heals. Better it should be lanced now, however painful, than left to fester beneath a comfortable silence. Chapter 12. The Breaking Point. It was Diana who broke first, and not, as Hastings had half expected, under any direct pressure from Poirot, but in the privacy of the rose garden, where Hastings himself had gone to smoke a solitary pipe and found her instead, sitting quite still upon the stone bench, with an expression of such rigid, contained grief that he very nearly retreated rather than intrude upon it. "Don't go, Captain Hastings," she said, before he could excuse himself. "I think I should rather like someone to talk to who isn't asking me questions with a purpose behind them." He sat, cautiously, and said nothing, and after a long moment she began to speak, not to him, precisely, but to the middle distance, in the flat, exhausted voice of a person who has been holding something too heavy for too long. "I've known for weeks that something was wrong with Rupert. Not what. I want you to believe that, Captain Hastings. I never suspected this. But something. He'd grown so careful, so watchful, jumping at questions he'd have answered easily enough a year ago. I asked him once, quite directly, whether there was money trouble, and he laughed it off so quickly that I knew there was, and was too much of a coward. No, that isn't fair. Too proud, perhaps, to admit it to me. You needn't tell me any of this," Hastings said gently, "if it distresses you. I want to tell someone. I think I've wanted to tell someone for a fortnight, and there hasn't been anyone I trusted enough." She twisted her engagement ring, a modest diamond, nothing so fine as a family crest, round and round upon her finger, in a gesture that struck Hastings, with sudden unease, as uncomfortably close to Rupert's own habit of turning his signet ring when troubled. "Yesterday, after that dreadful business with Mr. Pemberton's ledgers, I confronted him directly. I told him I knew something was terribly wrong, and that I would rather know the worst of it from his own mouth than piece it together from Monsieur Poirot's questions. "Nothing," she said, and her voice cracked at last, the careful composure finally giving way. "Nothing at all, Captain Hastings. He simply looked at me with such an expression of despair that I understood, all at once, that whatever I feared, the truth was very much worse. He said only that he loved me, and that whatever happened, I must believe that much was true, and then he walked away and shut himself in his room, and hasn't come out since except for meals, at which he says almost nothing." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "I keep thinking of Uncle Nathaniel's face, that morning in the orchard. I keep thinking of that dreadful mark in the earth, and wondering, I can't help wondering, though I hate myself for it, whether he was trying to tell us the very thing I'm now too frightened to say aloud myself." Hastings, uncertain what comfort could honestly be offered, said only that Poirot was a man of great fairness as well as great cleverness, and that whatever the truth proved to be, it would be arrived at properly, and not by guesswork or unkindness. Diana nodded, without much conviction, and the two of them sat together in the fading afternoon light, until the dinner bell summoned them both back to a house that had, in the space of 3 days, become entirely unfamiliar to her. Chapter 13. Poirot's Small Deception. That evening, Poirot assembled the household in the drawing-room under the pretext, delivered with such convincing gravity that even Hastings, who knew it for an invention, found himself half persuaded of a routine insurance formality. "You will forgive the intrusion upon your grief," he said, addressing the room at large. "But Mr. Latimer's affairs, I am informed by Mr. Pemberton, included a schedule of personal valuables insured under his estate policy. Rings, watches, small items of family jewelry, which must now, as a matter of routine, be verified against the schedule before the estate can properly proceed to probate. I am asked, in my small capacity as consultant to the inspector's inquiry, to assist in this verification. It will take only a few moments of your time, and I am sure none of you would wish to delay matters unnecessarily for the sake of Mr. Pemberton's paperwork." It was a request so mundane, so entirely in keeping with the tedious bureaucracy that follows any death, that not one person in the room thought to question it, save, Hastings noted, Rupert Ainsworth, whose hand moved for the briefest instant toward his right hand before he mastered the impulse and let it fall still in his lap. One by one, at Poirot's gentle request, the gentlemen of the household produced their rings and watches for his inspection. Gerald's plain gold band, Colonel Ashworth's bare and ringless fingers offered almost with relief, Dr. Faraday's signet, bearing nothing more sinister than his own initials in an ordinary Roman face. Poirot examined each with every appearance of bureaucratic thoroughness, made small notes in a pocketbook, and thanked each gentleman with courteous indifference. When he came at last to Rupert Ainsworth, there was a pause, brief but unmistakable, before the young solicitor drew the ring from his finger and placed it, with a hand that was not quite steady, into Poirot's waiting palm. Poirot turned it slowly beneath the drawing-room's lamplight, his small eyes moving over the ornate, interlocking device worked into its face. 2 letters, R and A, wound together with the elaborate flourish of an old family's heraldic vanity, in a pattern that, viewed quickly, or by an unsteady, failing hand, might indeed resolve itself into something not unlike a looping doubled curve scratched hastily into soft earth. "A very handsome piece," Poirot said mildly, still turning it in the light. "Your mother's family crest, I understand, Monsieur Ainsworth. Tell me, you wore this ring, of course, on the evening Mr. Latimer died." "I wear it every day, Monsieur Poirot. I have done since my 21st birthday. I hardly think that signifies anything at all." "Perhaps not," said Poirot, and returned the ring with a small bow of thanks that gave away nothing whatever of the thoughts working behind his tranquil expression. But Hastings, watching closely, saw that Poirot's eyes had not left the ring until the very moment it was safely back upon Rupert Ainsworth's finger, and understood that the small, mundane comedy of the insurance schedule had accomplished precisely what it had been designed to accomplish, and that his friend was now, at last, entirely certain. Chapter 14. The Gathering in the Drawing-Room. The following evening, at Poirot's request, and with Inspector Reeves standing discreetly by the door, the household of Thistlewood Hall assembled once more in the drawing-room, not this time under any pretext of insurance schedules, but for a purpose that every person in the room understood, with varying degrees of dread, to be the true and final one. Diana sat very white and still beside Gerald, her hand gripped so tightly in his that her knuckles had gone pale. Colonel Ashworth stood by the cold hearth with the forced, brittle composure of a man determined to face whatever came standing upright. Dr. Faraday had positioned himself near the window, his professional stillness for once betrayed by the restless movement of his hands. Celia Vane sat a little apart, as she had sat apart from the family's grief throughout, watching the room with the sharp, unsentimental eye of an artist observing a composition not yet resolved, and Rupert Ainsworth sat beside his fiancée, upright and correct, his face arranged into an expression of careful, lawyerly attention that fooled, Hastings thought, absolutely no one. Hastings, taking his customary place a little apart with his notebook, found himself reflecting on the strangeness of the scene. that a room so recently the setting for tea and idle conversation should now feel, with only the addition of Inspector Reeves's silent, watchful presence by the door, so entirely transformed into something resembling a courtroom. The evening light through the tall windows had gone the colour of old brass, and somewhere in the house a clock struck the half-hour with a chime that seemed, in the prevailing silence, unnaturally loud. "Must this really take the form of a performance, Monsieur Poirot?" Colonel Ashworth burst out, unable to bear the silence a moment longer. "If you know who did this thing, man, why not simply tell the inspector and have done with it, rather than parading the rest of us through it, like players in some melodrama?" "Because, Colonel," Poirot replied, unruffled, "a truth arrived at in private, and announced without explanation, convinces no one, least of all, I think, the person who must presently answer for it. I find that murderers, like other men, cling most stubbornly to their innocence when they believe the case against them to be built on suspicion rather than proof. I intend, this evening, to leave no room for that particular comfort." Poirot stood before the cold hearth, small and neat and entirely composed, and surveyed the room for a long moment before he began to speak. "Mesdames, Messieurs, I have asked you to gather here this evening because I am now in a position to tell you with complete certainty how Nathaniel Latimer met his death, and at whose hand. I ask your patience, for the explanation is not a short one, and I ask also your forbearance, for it will require me to speak of matters that some among you would prefer remained private. But a man is dead, and he did not die of his own failing heart, however conveniently that explanation might have served certain interests in this room. He died because someone here required, very urgently, that he should die before Thursday morning arrived, and the new will with it." He paused, and let his gaze move, slow and deliberate, across every face turned toward him. "Let us begin, as Mr. Latimer himself began, at the very end, with a dying man's hand, and the mark it left in the soft earth of his own orchard. For I believe, mesdames et messieurs, that this mark has been misread by every person in this house from the first morning it was discovered, and that its correct reading points, with a clarity I do not think any of you have yet permitted yourselves to consider, directly and unmistakably to the person who killed him." Chapter 15. The Reveal, Part 1. Let us dispose, first, of those among you whose guilt, on close examination, does not survive scrutiny. Poirot's gaze settled first upon Colonel Ashworth. "Colonel, you owe a very great deal of money, not £400, as you first admitted, but very nearly 2,000, spread across creditors whose patience is now, by your own account, exhausted. This is a genuine motive, and I do not dismiss it lightly. But you wear no signet ring, Colonel, and have not, by every account including your own households, worn one in years, and the mark in the earth, as I shall demonstrate, was unmistakably the mark of such a ring. Moreover, your alibi with Mr. Gerald Latimer, in the billiard room until 6:30, is confirmed independently by the butler on 2 separate occasions. I do not believe you killed Nathaniel Latimer, Colonel, whatever the state of your finances." The Colonel's shoulders sagged with an audible release of tension that he made no effort to disguise. "Dr. Faraday, your alibi is confirmed by Mrs. Hobbs, who observed you engaged upon the telephone for the greater part of the critical hour, within sight of her pantry. You had, moreover, no legacy formally promised you under either will, and disappointment at an informal hope, however genuine, is a thinner motive than the desperate necessities that drive most men to murder. I do not believe it was you." Faraday inclined his head, saying nothing, though something in his rigid posture eased fractionally. "Mademoiselle Vane, you stood to lose a considerable sum by Mr. Latimer's death, your promised patronage, your annuity, your exhibition, and gain nothing whatever, since the will that would have benefited you was never signed. A murderer does not, as a rule, kill the goose before it has laid the golden egg, and I do not believe you would have been so foolish as to strike before Thursday morning, when the will was to be executed, rather than waiting those 2 short remaining days. Your alibi, in any case, is confirmed by the gardener, who places you in the rose garden for the greater part of the critical hour. Celia's carefully composed face showed, for just a moment, an unguarded flash of relief. Mr. Gerald Latimer, you and Colonel Ashworth confirm one another's presence in the billiard room throughout the relevant hour, a fact independently attested by your butler. And though the new will would have reduced your inheritance, you had, I think, made your peace with this reduction some days before your uncle's death. Mr. Pemberton informs me you told him, in a private conversation he did not think significant until I asked him directly, that you found your uncle's plans for Miss Vane's welfare rather touching in his gruff way, and that you did not intend to contest them, however your cousin might feel on the matter. This is not the sentiment of a man planning murder over reduced expectations. Gerald flushed, but did not deny it. Miss Diana Latimer, I have considered your position also, though I do not think any person in this room seriously believed you capable of the act. Your alibi for the critical hour rests, it is true, upon your own word alone, since you were resting privately in your room with a headache. But a woman who is truly plotting the death of her own uncle does not, in my experience, request that a housemaid attend her at a fixed and predictable hour, as you did that evening. She contrives, rather, to be unobserved at precisely the moment her presence elsewhere might be required. And the depth of your grief these last days, mademoiselle, however you have laboured to master it in company, has not been the performance of a guilty conscience, but the plain and unguarded article. I set your name aside from the first day of this inquiry, though I did not say so until now. Diana's breath left her in a long, unsteady exhalation, and Gerald's arm tightened about her shoulders. This leaves us, said Poirot, and his voice grew very quiet, with two people whose alibis for the critical hour rest upon their own word alone, unconfirmed by any independent witness, and one of whom, moreover, possesses upon his own hand, at this very moment, the one object in this room capable of producing, in soft and yielding earth, the precise double-curved mark that a dying man's failing fingers were able to trace before life left them altogether. Every eye in the room turned, as one, toward Rupert Ainsworth, whose careful composure had, at last, begun visibly to crack. Chapter 16. The Reveal, Part 2. Monsieur Ainsworth, said Poirot, and his voice, though still perfectly courteous, had taken on the particular gravity of a man who no longer speaks in hypothesis. You told me you were in Mr. Latimer's study briefly after 5 o'clock, on a matter you described as confidential trust business. I put it to you now that this business concerned the Kavanagh Trust, of which you and Mr. Latimer were joint trustees, and that you had, over the preceding 18 months, withdrawn some £3,000 from that trust against forged countersignatures, with the trust's audit falling due within the month, and no honest means remaining to you of concealing what you had done. Diana's hand, still gripped in Gerald's, had gone rigid. Her face, turned toward Rupert, had drained entirely of colour. I put it to you further that some days before Mr. Latimer's death, you had occasion to see, upon Mr. Pemberton's desk, during an unattended interval of some 20 minutes, the draft of a new will that would substantially reduce Miss Diana Latimer's inheritance, the very funds you had hoped, however desperately and dishonourably, to draw upon in order to repair the deficit in the Kavanagh Trust before its audit exposed you. You understood, in that moment, that you faced a choice between confession and ruin on the one hand, and a very much darker alternative on the other, provided only that Mr. Latimer did not survive to see Thursday morning arrive. This is conjecture, Rupert said, but his voice had lost its lawyer's steadiness entirely. You cannot prove any of this. I can prove, said Poirot, unmoved, that you were alone with Mr. Latimer shortly after he took the whisky, in which, the post-mortem confirms, a fatal quantity of digitalis was subsequently found. I can prove, by the housemaid Ellen's independent account, that you emerged from that interview white about the mouth, in evident distress. I can prove that your alibi for the remainder of the critical hour rests upon nothing but your own unsupported word. And I can demonstrate, He drew from his pocket the photograph of the earthmark, and beside it, a small pencil, tracing he had made of Rupert's own signet ring, that the mark left by a dying man's hand corresponds, with a precision that admits of no innocent coincidence, to the interlocking letters worked into the crest you wear upon your finger at this very moment. Nathaniel Latimer, a man trained by 40 years in the insurance trade to record identifying marks rather than mere names, used the last purposeful movement of his dying hand not to write a word, but to sketch, as accurately as failing strength allowed, the very device his killer's hand had pressed against his own as he fell. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Rupert Ainsworth, all pretense finally abandoned, put his face in his hands, and when he spoke again, it was in the flat, exhausted voice of a man too tired to sustain a lie any longer. "I never meant it to happen as it did," he said. "I told myself, God help me, that it would look like his heart, that no one would ever think to question it. He was an old man, and unwell, and everyone knew it. I put the digitalis in his whiskey, and I meant to go straight to my room and let matters take their course. But I couldn't. I had to know it had worked. Don't you see? I couldn't simply walk away not knowing, and when I saw him stagger out toward the orchard, clutching at his chest, I followed him. I meant only to watch from a distance. But he fell, and he called out. Not my name. He hadn't the strength for that. Just a sort of cry. And before I understood what I was doing, I'd gone to him. Some instinct of decency I didn't know I still possessed. God forgive me for it. And he caught at my hand as he fell the last of the way, and I felt his eyes on my face, on my hand, in the last moment before they went empty. I knew then what he'd seen. I told myself he was too far gone to understand it, to remember it. I told myself a great many things, walking back to the house that night, none of which I believed even as I thought them. Diana had begun, very quietly, to weep, and Gerald's arm had gone about her shoulders, though his own face was white with an anger he was plainly struggling to contain. I did love you, Rupert said, turning to her at last, his composure entirely gone. That much, at least, was never a lie. It scarcely matters now, does it? Diana said, through her tears, whether it was true or not. Colonel Ashworth had sunk into a chair, his earlier bluster entirely spent, and Dr. Faraday stood very still by the window, his professional composure at last restored now that suspicion had lifted from his own shoulders, though his face showed plainly enough the sorrow of a man who had, in his own way, been fond of the household he had served so long. Celia Vane had risen and crossed, without a word, to sit beside Diana, taking the younger woman's cold hand in her own, with a simple, wordless solidarity that struck Hastings as the truest thing he had witnessed in that entire long and painful evening. "I should like it understood," Rupert said, rising unsteadily as Reeves approached him, "that whatever I have done, I never intended that anyone else should suffer for it. I let the mark in the earth be taken for a mystery, when I might have come forward and confessed, and spared this family the further agony of these last days. That failure of courage, I think, is very nearly as great a sin as the act itself, and I do not ask forgiveness for either." Nobody in the room answered him, and it was in that particular silence, heavier, somehow, than any accusation could have been, that Inspector Reeves stepped forward, and the formal words of arrest, spoken into the ruin of that once elegant drawing-room, brought the affair of Thistlewood Hall to its proper and inevitable close. Chapter 17. The Reflection. They left Thistlewood Hall 2 days later, once the formalities of statement and inquest had been concluded, and Poirot, walking with Hastings to the waiting motor car through the same walled orchard where the tragedy had begun, was unusually thoughtful. "You are sad, mon ami?" Hastings asked, surprised, for he had rarely seen his friend anything but brisk satisfaction at the conclusion of a case successfully resolved. "A little sad, yes, though not, I think, for the reasons you suppose. I am not sad that a guilty man has been brought to justice. This is as it should be, and I do not weep for murderers, however wretched their circumstances. I am sad, Hastings, for the particular tragedy of a clever man who believed, quite wrongly, that cleverness alone could save him from the consequences of a single desperate error, the taking of £3,000 that was not his, when the truth is that one dishonesty very rarely remains contained within itself. It reaches outward like a stain in water and touches things the dishonest man never intended it to touch, until at last it has drowned not only himself, but everyone who loved him. They paused beneath the largest of the apple trees, where the earth had long since been smoothed and the fallen apples gathered, and no trace remained of what had occurred there, save the memory each of them now carried away. "And Diana?" Hastings asked. "What becomes of her, do you think, after all this?" "She is young, Hastings, and she has courage. I saw a great deal of it these last difficult days, more than she perhaps credits herself with. She will grieve for her uncle, and grieve too, in a quieter and more complicated way, for the man she believed Rupert Ainsworth to be, which is not quite the same thing as grieving for the man he actually was. But she will not be destroyed by it. The young recover from wounds that would permanently cripple an older heart, provided only that those who love them have the sense to stand quietly by and let the healing take its own time. Mr. Gerald Latimer, I think, will make sure of that much, if I am any judge of the way he looked at his cousin in that drawing-room. I keep thinking," Hastings said slowly, "of what Miss Vane said, that first morning, that he was trying to tell us who killed him, even as he was dying. It seems almost impossible that a dying man's last gesture should be so precise, so purposeful. Does it, Hastings? I do not find it so very impossible. Consider what manner of man Nathaniel Latimer was. Proud, exacting, a lifetime spent in the careful assessment of claims and the identification of frauds. Such habits of mind, I think, run very deep indeed, deeper perhaps than conscious thought itself, so that even as his own life was extinguished, some essential part of him reached, quite instinctively, for the tool of his trade, the careful recording of an identifying mark, because it was the one gesture his failing mind could still perform with certainty, when words themselves had already become too much to ask of him." Poirot shook his head slowly. "It is, in its way, Hastings, a rather magnificent testament to a man's character, that even in death he could not help but leave behind him one final, honest piece of evidence, a small, stubborn insistence on the truth, scratched into the earth with the very last of his strength, that no amount of another man's cleverness could ultimately silence." He turned then toward the waiting motor car, settling his hat with the particular precision Hastings had come to associate with the closing of a case and the restoration, in his friend's orderly mind, of a world once more set properly to rights. "Come, mon ami. Lower Chetwynd awaits us, and I believe I have earned, after these last difficult days, a very quiet week of doing absolutely nothing at all. Though I confess, I say this every time, Hastings, and you and I both know perfectly well how rarely it proves to be true." And with that, Hercule Poirot climbed into the motor car, and Thistlewood Hall, with its walled orchard and its shattered household, fell away behind them into the soft grey distance of the English afternoon. The end.